two things have been happening for a very long time. Science has spent 4 centuries building an ever more precise account of the universe, from the orbit of planets to the folding of proteins, until it can predict eclipses to the second and edit a single gene with a pair of molecular scissors. At the same time, on a much smaller scale, ordinary human bodies have kept doing things that same science still cannot fully explain. Why a stranger's yawn makes you yawn, why a sugar pill can dull real pain, why déjà vu arrives like a memory of a moment that never happened. This is not a list of ancient superstitions waiting for modern minds to correct them. Every item here has been studied by serious researchers in real laboratories, often for decades, and the honest current answer is still some version of "we are not sure." That includes some of the most private sensations you have ever had, and some of the largest structures in the universe. One of the items ahead involves a manuscript that no scholar on Earth has ever managed to read. Another involves the very fabric of time, which physics insists could run backward just as easily as forward, and yet never does. There is no rush here, settle in. Nothing about the next 2 hours needs to be solved by the end of it. Some of the oldest, most ordinary parts of being alive are also, it turns out, the least understood. And there is a particular kind of pleasure in sitting with a good mystery instead of closing it too quickly. You are standing in a room you have never visited, having a conversation you have never had, and for 2 or 3 seconds you are certain you have lived this exact moment before. Most adults report feeling this at least once, often in their teens or 20s, and then less as they age. It has a name, borrowed from French, meaning already seen, but a name is not an expletive. For over a century, researchers have tried to pin down what is actually happening in the brain during those seconds, and no single account has won out. One leading idea points to the brain's memory system briefly misfiring so that a new experience gets tagged as familiar before it has actually been stored anywhere. Another focuses on the hippocampus and a nearby region called the rhinal cortex, which normally work together to judge whether something is new or known. If they fall very slightly out of sync, the theory goes, one part of the brain could signal familiarity while another correctly registers the scene as new, and the mismatch produces exactly the eerie doubled feeling people describe. A third line of research has come from an unexpected source. Patients with certain forms of epilepsy sometimes experience intense déjà vu right before a seizure, which suggests the sensation may be tied to a brief electrical disturbance in the temporal lobe, present in a much milder form in people who never have seizures at all. What makes déjà vu especially hard to study is its unpredictability. It cannot be reliably triggered on command in a laboratory, so most of what is known comes from self-report, brain scans taken after the fact, and the rare patient whose epilepsy gives researchers a narrow window into the phenomenon in real time. Virtual reality experiments have gotten closer, recreating scenes with subtle spatial similarities to earlier ones, and reliably producing a version of the feeling, which supports the memory mismatch idea without fully confirming it. Nobody disputes that déjà vu is real. What remains unsettled is which of several plausible brain mechanisms, or what combination of them, is actually responsible. The moment always passes before anyone can examine it closely enough. A patient is given a pill with no active ingredient in it, told plainly that it is inert, and their pain still drops by a measurable amount. This has been shown in controlled trials repeatedly, and it is one of the strangest findings in modern medicine because it removes the one explanation people usually reach for first, that the patient simply did not know. The placebo effect was first documented systematically in the 1950s, when researchers noticed that patients in the control group of drug trials, receiving nothing but sugar or saline, still improved at rates too high to dismiss as coincidence. Since then, it has been measured across pain, depression, irritable bowel symptoms, and even Parkinson's disease, where placebo treatment can trigger real, measurable dopamine release in the brain. The going explanation involves expectation. The brain, anticipating relief, appears to activate some of the same neural pathways a real drug would use, including the body's own opioid system. But expectation alone does not explain open-label placebo studies, where patients are told outright that the pill is fake and still improve. That result has forced researchers to consider that ritual itself, the act of taking a pill, seeing a doctor, being cared for, may carry a physiological effect independent of belief. The nocebo effect, its darker twin, complicates the picture further. Patients told a treatment might cause nausea sometimes develop nausea from a placebo, which means the body can be harmed by expectation just as it can be helped by it. Researchers have proposed that both effects trace back to the brain's role in predicting the body's future state and then partly enacting that prediction, but this remains a working hypothesis rather than a settled mechanism. What is certain is that the line between mind and body in this one narrow area is far blurrier than either word suggests. Somewhere between a thought and a chemical, the placebo effect keeps doing its quiet work. No other animal studied so far weeps from emotion the way humans do. Elephants have been seen with wet eyes after distress, and some primates whimper, but the deliberate, watery, emotional tear, the kind that streams down a face at a funeral or a wedding, appears to be a distinctly human trait, and biology still has not settled on why it exists. Humans produce 3 different kinds of tears. Basal tears keep the eye lubricated at all times. Reflex tears flush out irritants like onion vapor or dust. Emotional tears are chemically distinct from both, containing higher levels of stress hormones and natural painkillers, which has led some researchers to propose that crying may function as a way of physically expelling stress-related chemicals from the body. That theory is appealing, but the actual evidence that crying lowers stress hormones afterward is mixed, with some studies finding a mood improvement and others finding none at all. A separate and more widely supported theory treats crying as primarily a social signal rather than a private release. Tears are highly visible, hard to fake convincingly, and they reliably prompt sympathy and caregiving from people nearby, even strangers. Under this view, emotional tears may have been favored, not because they help the crier chemically, but because they reliably change the behavior of everyone watching, encouraging comfort, protection, or forgiveness at exactly the moments those responses would have mattered most across human history. Infants who cannot yet speak rely on crying as their only tool for summoning help, which lends some support to the social signal theory, though it does not fully explain why crying continues into adulthood in cultures with very different norms around displaying emotion. Whatever crying is actually for, it still arrives on its own schedule, uninvited and unstoppable. Read the word yawn enough times and you may feel the pull of one starting in your own jaw. It happens across species too. Dogs yawn when their owners do, and chimpanzees yawn when they watch videos of other chimps yawning. Humans start catching yawns from others as early as 1 year old, and by adulthood the contagion is strong enough to spread through a video call. For decades, the leading explanation was thermoregulation, the idea that yawning cools an overheated brain, and that contagious yawning spreads because nearby individuals share a similar environment and similar cooling needs. Experiments have supported part of this. People yawn more in warm rooms and less in cold ones, and yawning does appear to increase blood flow and airflow that could plausibly cool the brain slightly. What thermoregulation does not explain well is the social piece. Why a yawn specifically spreads from person to person, rather than simply occurring more often in a shared hot room independently. A competing theory treats contagious yawning as a form of unconscious empathy, tied to the same mirror neuron systems thought to help humans and some other animals automatically mimic each other's expressions. Brain imaging studies have found that people who score higher on empathy measures are somewhat more susceptible to contagious yawning, and that a region associated with social processing lights up when someone watches another person yawn. But the correlation is weak enough that some researchers remain unconvinced. It reflects true empathy rather than simple automatic imitation, the same reflex that makes people cross their arms after seeing someone else do it. A few animals never seem to catch a yawn at all, and no one has fully explained why they are the exception. A sudden, involuntary contraction of the diaphragm, followed almost instantly by the vocal cords snapping shut. That single reflex, repeated every few seconds until it stops on its own, is a hiccup, and despite being one of the most common minor bodily events a person experiences, doctors still cannot say with confidence why the human body is wired to do it at all. Hiccups can be triggered by eating too fast, carbonated drinks, sudden temperature changes, or nothing identifiable whatsoever. The reflex arc involves the phrenic nerve controlling the diaphragm and a coordinated signal to the throat, a circuit that researchers have mapped in detail. What remains unmapped is the purpose. Unlike coughing, which clearly protects the airway, or sneezing, which clearly expels irritants, hiccups do not obviously protect or help the body in any documented way. One of the more intriguing hypotheses treats hiccups as an evolutionary leftover from very early amphibian ancestors, whose method of breathing involved a similar sudden gulping motion to move air and water past their gills before lungs had fully taken over. Human fetuses hiccup frequently in the womb, sometimes before the lungs are developed enough to breathe air at all, which some researchers see as suggestive support for this ancient origin, since a leftover reflex might be expected to appear early and automatically. Others are skeptical, pointing out that fetal hiccups could simply be practice contractions for the diaphragm muscle, rather than evidence of any amphibian inheritance. Remedies for hiccups number in the dozens, from holding one's breath to being startled, and nearly all of them work at least some of the time, which is itself a small clue that no one fully understands the reflex they are interrupting. Soak in a bath long enough, and your fingertips pucker into ridges, while the skin on your forearm right beside the water stays perfectly smooth. For a long time this was assumed to be simple physics, water, swelling the outer layer of skin like a sponge. Then researchers discovered something that physics alone could not explain. People with certain nerve injuries in a hand do not wrinkle at all, even after a long soak, which means the wrinkling is not passive absorption, but an active response controlled by the nervous system. The wrinkling is caused by blood vessels beneath the fingertip skin narrowing in a specific pattern, pulling the skin inward and creating the pruned appearance, a reaction triggered by the sympathetic nervous system in response to prolonged moisture. That much has been confirmed in the lab. What has not been confirmed is why the body bothers to do this at all. The leading hypothesis, sometimes called the wet grip theory, suggests that the ridge pattern formed by wrinkling may work like the tread on a tire, channeling water away from the fingertip and improving grip on wet surfaces or underwater objects. A handful of experiments have tested this directly, asking participants to move wet objects with either wrinkled or unwrinkled fingers, and the results have been mixed. Some found a modest grip advantage with wrinkled skin. Others found no measurable difference at all, and a few even found wrinkled fingers performed slightly worse on dry surfaces afterward. The theory remains the most popular explanation in circulation, largely because it is the only one that makes evolutionary sense of a reflex this specific, but it has not cleared the bar of consistent experimental confirmation. The body commits to the wrinkle fully every time, whether or not it actually helps. A sneeze can expel air and droplets from the nose and mouth at a startling speed, fast enough that early researchers assumed it must be purely mechanical, a simple clearing of the airway. Most sneezes fit that description. A meaningful minority of people, however, sneeze not from irritation but from something else entirely, stepping out of a dark room into bright sunlight. This is called the photic sneeze reflex, and it affects roughly 1 in every 4 or 5 people, running in families in a pattern that suggests a genetic cause. The reflex has been documented since antiquity, noted by Aristotle, who wondered why looking at the sun could make a person sneeze. Modern researchers have located a specific region on human chromosome 2 associated with the trait, but they still do not fully understand the wiring that connects a burst of light hitting the retina to a sneeze reflex normally reserved for nasal irritation. The leading explanation involves a kind of neural crosstalk. The nerve that controls pupil constriction in response to light runs close to the nerve that triggers sneezing, and one hypothesis holds that a sudden strong light signal can spill over and accidentally trigger the neighboring sneeze pathway, essentially a wiring error that happens to be common enough to be considered a normal variant rather than a disorder. This has never been directly observed at the cellular level, so it remains an inference from anatomy rather than a confirmed mechanism. Doctors do take the reflex seriously in one practical sense. Fighter pilots are sometimes screened for it, since an uncontrollable sneeze triggered by sudden bright light could be dangerous during a maneuver. For most people it stays a curious footnote, triggered every time they step outside on a bright morning. For most of medical history, itch was treated as a weak form of pain, a lesser cousin that simply used the same nerves at a lower intensity. That assumption held for decades until researchers identified a dedicated set of nerve fibers and a specific molecule, later named gastrin-releasing peptide, that carries itch signals along a pathway separate from pain. Itch, it turns out, is its own sense. This discovery reframed a puzzle doctors had struggled with for years: chronic itch that appears with no rash, no allergen, and no identifiable skin condition at all. Some cases trace to nerve damage, some to liver or kidney disease disrupting the chemical signals that reach the skin, and a smaller number resist every test and imaging scan available. In these unexplained cases, patients can scratch until the skin breaks without ever finding relief, because the itch signal appears to originate somewhere in the nervous system itself, rather than in the skin being scratched. Scratching offers only brief relief because it works partly through pain. A small jolt of discomfort at the itch site temporarily overrides the itch signal in the spinal cord, a trade the brain seems willing to make, even though it does not solve anything. Some researchers have proposed that itch evolved primarily as a way to detect and remove small parasites or irritants from the skin surface, which would explain why it is so hard to ignore. But this does not account for the substantial number of itch cases that appear to originate entirely inside the nervous system, disconnected from anything actually touching the skin. An itch with no cause is, medically speaking, still just an itch, waiting to be scratched. Try to tickle the sole of your own foot and almost nothing happens, no matter how precisely you mimic the motion someone else would use. Have another person do the exact same motion and the response can be immediate and uncontrollable. This asymmetry has been studied for years, and the leading explanation involves a small structure at the back of the brain called the cerebellum. The cerebellum's job includes predicting the sensory consequences of your own movements a fraction of a second before they happen, which is part of how you can walk without consciously monitoring every footstep. When you move your own hand toward your own foot, the cerebellum anticipates the exact sensation that motion will produce and dampens the brain's response to it, since a predicted, self-caused sensation carries little new information worth reacting to strongly. A touch from someone else cannot be predicted the same way, so the sensory signal arrives at full strength, and the tickle response fires normally. Researchers have tested this using robotic devices that delay the connection between a person's own hand movement and the resulting touch, even by a fraction of a second. As the delay increases, the self-tickle sensation becomes noticeably stronger, supporting the idea that timing and predictability, not the touch itself, are what determine whether tickling registers. A small number of people with certain psychiatric conditions involving disrupted self-monitoring have reported being able to tickle themselves, which researchers see as consistent with the prediction theory, since their internal forecasting system may not be cancelling the sensation the way it normally would. The body, in this one narrow way, refuses to be surprised by itself. General anesthesia has been used in surgery since the 1840s, and it is, by any measure, one of the safest and most reliable procedures in modern medicine. Millions of operations happen every year with a patient fully unconscious, feeling nothing, remembering nothing, and waking up as if no time has passed. And yet, how anesthetic drugs actually switch off consciousness remains one of the open questions in neuroscience. For a long time, the assumption was that anesthetics worked simply by dissolving into the fatty membrane of brain cells and disrupting them non-specifically, since a wide range of chemically unrelated compounds, from ether to modern intravenous drugs, all produce unconsciousness despite having very different molecular structures. This is now known to be too simple. Researchers have since identified specific receptors in the brain, particularly ones involved in a calming neurotransmitter called GABA, that many anesthetics act on directly, but identifying the receptors is not the same as explaining consciousness itself, or why blocking certain circuits produces total unawareness rather than simple drowsiness. Brain imaging during anesthesia has shown a striking pattern. Communication between distant brain regions drops sharply, even though individual regions may still show electrical activity. This has led to a leading hypothesis that consciousness depends less on any single brain area and more on the brain's ability to integrate information across many areas at once, and that anesthesia works by breaking that integration rather than shutting the brain down entirely. This idea, sometimes called integrated information theory, is influential but far from universally accepted, and some researchers argue it explains correlations without explaining the underlying cause. Every anesthesiologist can reliably produce unconsciousness. No one can yet fully explain what unconsciousness at the deepest level actually is. Picture the strangest dream you can remember. It probably had a setting, characters, some kind of unfolding events, even if the logic made no sense on waking. The brain during the stage of sleep called REM is intensely active, in some measures more active than during calm wakefulness. What it does with all that activity, and why it assembles it into something story-shaped rather than pure noise, is still genuinely unsettled. One influential theory treats dreaming as a byproduct of memory consolidation, the nightly process where the brain sorts through the day's experiences and strengthens the ones worth keeping. Under this view, dreams are something like the visible exhaust of that sorting process, fragments of memory and emotion loosely stitched together by whatever brain regions happen to be active. A competing theory, called threat simulation, proposes that dreaming evolved specifically to rehearse dangerous or emotionally charged scenarios in a low-risk setting, which would explain why dreams involving being chased or falling are reported so consistently across very different cultures. A third and more recent theory focuses on the visual cortex, the brain's image processing region, suggesting that dreaming keeps it active during sleep so it does not lose function from disuse, similar to how eyelids twitch during REM to keep tear ducts working. None of these theories has been ruled out, and none has been confirmed strongly enough to displace the others, partly because dreams can only be studied indirectly, through what people remember and choose to report after waking, which is itself an imperfect record of whatever actually happened in the sleeping brain. Every night the brain writes something, and mostly erases it before morning. Every animal with a sufficiently complex nervous system that has ever been studied sleeps in some form, from jellyfish-like creatures with no brain at all to elephants that sleep as little as 2 hours a night. Sleep leaves an animal vulnerable, unable to watch for predators, unable to eat, and yet it has persisted across the entire tree of animal life for hundreds of millions of years. That persistence is itself evidence that sleep must be doing something essential, but which something remains contested. One major theory treats sleep as primarily restorative, a period when the body repairs tissue, replenishes energy stores, and clears out cellular waste. Recent research has given this theory real support. During deep sleep, the spaces between brain cells appear to widen slightly, allowing cerebrospinal fluid to flush out waste products, including proteins linked to certain forms of dementia when they accumulate. A second major theory centers on memory, since sleep, especially its deeper stages, appears to help stabilize and strengthen memories formed during the day, a process that studies of sleep deprivation have shown breaks down noticeably when sleep is cut short. What neither theory fully explains is why sleep has to involve full or near full unconsciousness, rather than some lighter resting state that would allow an animal to stay alert to danger while still getting the same restorative or memory benefits. Some marine mammals sleep with one half of the brain at a time, alternating sides, which shows that partial sleep is biologically possible, and researchers still debate why most animals, including humans, never evolved that safer compromise. Whatever sleep is ultimately for, no animal studied so far has found a way to live entirely without it. A cat can purr while being petted, while eating, and more strangely, while injured, in pain, or even while dying. This last fact alone should make purring hard to explain as a simple contentment signal, and researchers who study it agree the picture is more complicated than it first appears. Mechanically, purring is reasonably well understood. It is produced by rapid, repeated signals from the brain to the muscles of the larynx, causing the vocal cords to vibrate during both inhaling and exhaling, producing a continuous sound at a frequency of roughly 25 to 150 Hz. What is not settled is why cats purr across such a wide range of emotional and physical states. One hypothesis proposes that purring functions as a form of self-soothing or even self-healing, since the specific frequency range it falls into overlaps with frequencies shown in some studies to promote bone density and tissue repair, which would help explain why an injured cat might purr even in obvious distress. This healing hypothesis remains unproven in cats specifically, since most of the supporting frequency research comes from studies on bone and tissue cells in other contexts entirely, not from direct experiments on purring cats themselves. A separate, more behavioral theory treats purring as primarily a communication and bonding signal, especially between mother cats and kittens, who purr together within days of birth, long before kittens can see or hear well, suggesting the sound may serve as an early, low-cost way to maintain contact and reassurance. No single explanation accounts for every situation a purr shows up in, which may simply mean the sound serves more than one purpose at once. A sudden chill, a swelling piece of music, an unexpected memory, and the skin along your arms rises into small firm bumps. The reflex is called piloerection, and it works by tiny muscles at the base of each hair follicle contracting, pulling the hair upright. In animals with thick fur, this visibly traps a layer of warm air near the skin and makes the animal look larger to a threat. Two clear survival functions. In humans, whose body hair is far too sparse to trap meaningful warmth or bulk up an intimidating silhouette, the reflex still fires exactly the same way. The leading explanation treats goosebumps as an evolutionary leftover, a reflex inherited wholesale from a much hairier ancestor, still wired into the nervous system, even though the body it now controls can no longer make practical use of it. This is a plausible and widely accepted account for the cold-triggered version of goosebumps. It is less satisfying as an explanation for the emotional version, the chill that runs down the arms during a moving piece of music or a powerful memory, since there is no obvious ancestral survival benefit to bristling in response to a song. A more recent line of research has proposed that the same nerve signal responsible for raising the hair follicle may also stimulate nearby stem cells that help regenerate hair over time, suggesting the reflex, whatever its original purpose, may have been repurposed to serve a small ongoing role in hair follicle health. This remains an early and specific finding, rather than a full explanation of why goosebumps also respond so reliably to emotion. The body keeps the old reflex running, useful or not, every time something moves it. Of all the body's involuntary reactions, blushing might be the strangest, because it is visible to everyone except the person experiencing it. You cannot see your own blush directly, only feel the heat, while everyone facing you watches your face redden in real time. Charles Darwin called it the most peculiar and most human of all expressions, and more than a century later, the exact reason for it is still debated. Mechanically, blushing happens when blood vessels in the face dilate suddenly, usually triggered by the sympathetic nervous system in response to embarrassment, attention, or social exposure. What makes blushing unusual among stress responses is that it is almost impossible to suppress voluntarily. You can hold back tears with effort, control your breathing under pressure, and mostly keep your face neutral, but a blush, once triggered, proceeds largely on its own. Some researchers argue this involuntary quality is the entire point. Because a blush cannot be faked convincingly, it functions as an honest, unfakeable social signal of embarrassment or acknowledgement of a social mistake, which can help diffuse tension and prompt forgiveness from others. This social signal theory fits well with studies showing that people who blush after making an obvious social error are often judged more favorably by observers than people who show no visible reaction at all, as though the blush itself communicates remorse. What remains less clear is the underlying neural trigger, why self-consciousness specifically, more than other strong emotions like fear or anger, produces this particular vascular response, and why some people blush far more easily and intensely than others under seemingly identical circumstances. Whatever it is meant to communicate, it always arrives before permission is asked. A hypnotized subject can be told their arm is stuck to the table and genuinely struggle to lift it, or told a strong smell sensed and report enjoying it. These effects are real and have been measured repeatedly under controlled conditions using brain imaging. What hypnosis actually is, at a fundamental level, remains a genuine scientific disagreement, not a settled fact, quietly waiting for the public to catch up. One camp of researchers treats hypnosis as an altered state of consciousness, a distinct mode of brain function different from ordinary wakefulness, supported by imaging studies showing reduced activity in a brain network associated with self-monitoring and increased connectivity with certain other regions during a hypnotic state. Under this view, hypnosis genuinely changes how the brain processes suggestion, attention, and sensory information, similar in some ways to deep absorption or meditative states. A second, competing camp argues that hypnosis is better explained by ordinary psychological processes, heightened expectation, social compliance, and a willingness to imaginatively go along with a scenario without requiring any special altered brain state at all. This view points out that highly motivated, highly imaginative people can produce hypnosis-like effects with no formal induction whatsoever, simply by being asked to imagine vividly, which would be surprising if hypnosis required a genuinely distinct trance state to occur. Both camps agree that hypnotic susceptibility varies enormously between individuals, with some people barely responsive and others dropping into a deep hypnotic state within seconds, and neither camp has fully explained why that variation exists. The debate has continued for decades without either side conceding, largely because both interpretations fit the same observed data reasonably well. Somewhere between suggestion and a genuinely altered mind, hypnosis keeps working, even without full agreement on what it is. After an amputation, the majority of patients report continuing to feel the missing limb, its position, its temperature, sometimes intense pain in a foot or hand that is no longer physically present. This is not confusion or imagination in the dismissive sense of the word. Brain scans show real, measurable activity in the region of the brain that once processed sensation from that limb, activity that persists years after the limb itself is gone. The leading explanation involves a process called cortical remapping, The brain maintains a detailed sensory map of the entire body, with each region of skin corresponding to a specific patch of brain tissue. When a limb is amputated, the brain area that once received its signals does not go silent. Instead, neighboring regions of the sensory map, representing nearby body parts, appear to gradually invade the now basa's territory, and this reorganization is thought to sometimes misfire, generating false sensory signals that the brain interprets as coming from the limb that no longer exists. This remapping theory led to one of the more elegant treatments in modern neurology, mirror therapy, where a patient positions a mirror to create a visual illusion that their missing limb is present and moving, using the reflection of the intact limb. For reasons still not fully explained, this simple visual trick can reduce phantom pain in a meaningful share of patients, as though giving the brain visual evidence that contradicts the false pain signal helps override it. Why the trick works for some patients and not others remains an open question, and the deeper mechanism connecting vision, the brain's body map, and pain perception is still being worked out. The brain in these cases keeps drawing a map of a country that no longer exists. Smallpox was eradicated. Polio has been driven to the edge of extinction. Measles has an effective vaccine that has existed for decades. The common cold, one of the most mundane illnesses a person can catch, has no cure and realistically is unlikely to get one in the near future. The reason has nothing to do with a lack of trying. The common cold is not caused by a single virus. It is caused by more than 200 distinct viruses, most of them rhinoviruses, along with a smaller number of coronaviruses and others, all producing similar symptoms through different biological routes. A vaccine effective against one strain typically offers little or no protection against the others, and rhinoviruses in particular mutate quickly, generating new variants faster than immunity can catch up. This is a fundamentally different problem than smallpox, which was caused by a single stable virus that the immune system, once exposed, could reliably recognize for life. Researchers have explored a few creative approaches, including vaccines that target a part of the rhinovirus that stays relatively stable across many strains, since attacking a stable structural feature rather than the fast-changing surface proteins could, in theory, offer broader protection. Some of this work has shown promise in early trials, but producing a vaccine effective against the full range of cold-causing viruses, at a cost and complexity that makes sense for a mild, self-limiting illness, has proven to be a genuinely difficult problem rather than a simple matter of funding or attention. For now, the common cold remains what it has always been: manageable, familiar, and quietly unsolved. To some people, cilantro tastes bright, citrusy, and pleasant. To others, it tastes unmistakably like soap, a reaction strong enough to ruin an entire dish. For years, this divide was assumed to be purely cultural or psychological, a matter of what a person grew up eating. Then genetic research uncovered something more specific. A large genetic study identified a variation in a gene called OR6A2, which codes for a receptor that detects certain aldehyde chemicals, the same compounds responsible for cilantro's distinctive smell and also found coincidentally in some soaps and lotions. People carrying a particular version of this gene appear to be more sensitive to these aldehydes, which researchers propose could explain why the soapy taste registers so strongly for a meaningful minority of people, thought to be around 1 in 7 to 1 in 5, depending on the population studied. What the genetic finding does not fully explain is the sizable number of people who dislike cilantro despite not carrying the identified gene variant, or the fact that some people who initially find it soapy can grow to enjoy it over repeated exposure, something that would be harder to explain if the reaction were purely a fixed genetic wiring issue. This has led researchers to conclude that genetics likely explains part of the cilantro divide, but not all of it, with learned taste preference and repeated exposure also playing a real role that has not yet been cleanly separated from the genetic factor in most studies. The same leaf, on the same plate, keeps arriving as two entirely different foods. Slice into an onion, and within seconds your eyes begin to sting and water, sometimes badly enough to force you to step away from the cutting board entirely. The chemistry behind this is well understood in outline. Onion cells contain enzymes and sulfur compounds kept separate while the cell walls are intact. Cutting ruptures those walls, allowing the enzyme and the sulfur compound to mix and react, producing a volatile gas called synpropanethyl S-oxide, which drifts upward and, on contact with the thin moisture covering the eye, forms a mild sulfuric acid. The eye responds to this irritation exactly as it would to any foreign chemical, by producing reflex tears meant to dilute and flush the irritant away. This part of the mechanism is settled science, confirmed at the molecular level. What remains less well explained is the significant variation between people in how strongly they react. Some people barely tear up while chopping onions, others cannot get through a single one without their eyes streaming and their vision blurring. Sensitivity to the compound likely varies with factors including how close a person's face is to the cutting surface, how quickly the onion is cut, and individual differences in eye sensitivity, but no single study has fully quantified why the range between people is so large. A handful of cutting techniques, from chilling the onion beforehand to cutting under running water, appear to genuinely reduce the effect by limiting how much gas reaches the eyes, though there is no technique that eliminates it entirely for someone highly sensitive to the compound. The onion never intends any of it. It is simply defending cells that no longer have any way of knowing they have already lost. Imagine a ringing, hissing, or buzzing sound that never stops, audible in complete silence, and that no one else in the room can hear because it does not exist anywhere outside your own head. This is tinnitus, and it affects a substantial share of adults at some point, with a smaller number experiencing it as a constant, disruptive presence for years. Most tinnitus is linked to some degree of hearing damage, often from loud noise exposure, and the leading explanation involves the brain's auditory system compensating for a loss of input at certain frequencies. When the tiny hair cells in the inner ear that normally detect a specific frequency are damaged, the corresponding region of the brain's auditory processing area may respond by increasing its own spontaneous activity, essentially turning up its own internal gain in an attempt to detect a signal that is no longer arriving from the ear. That internally generated activity, the theory holds, is what gets perceived as a phantom sound, similar in structure to phantom limb sensation, but occurring in the auditory system instead of the sensory map for touch. This theory fits much of the available evidence, but it does not fully explain every case. A portion of tinnitus patients have completely normal hearing test results, showing no measurable hearing loss at all, which suggests some other mechanism, possibly involving the brain's stress response system or attention networks, may also be capable of generating the same phantom sound independently. Because tinnitus cannot be measured directly, only reported by the person experiencing it, researchers are also limited in how precisely they can study what is actually happening at any given moment inside the ringing. For those who live with it, the sound never confirms itself to anyone else, and never quite goes away either. Across recorded history, and across nearly every culture studied, roughly 1 in 10 people has been left-handed. The number is remarkably stable, showing up in ancient cave paintings, medieval manuscripts, and modern surveys alike, which suggests something deeply rooted is producing this specific ratio rather than culture or upbringing alone. What that something is remains genuinely unresolved. Handedness clearly has some genetic component, since left-handedness runs somewhat in families, and identical twins are more likely to share handedness than random individuals, though far from perfectly. This last detail is the real puzzle. Identical twins share essentially all of their genetic code, and yet a meaningful share of identical twin pairs still end up with one right-handed and one left-handed twin, which means genetics alone cannot be the full explanation. Researchers have proposed that random developmental factors in the womb, unrelated to genetics, may tip the balance during brain development, though the exact mechanism has not been pinned down. A separate line of research has looked at handedness from an evolutionary angle, asking why left-handedness has persisted at all if it carries any disadvantage in a right-hand dominant world, from scissors to school desks. One hypothesis, sometimes called the fighting hypothesis, suggests that left-handedness may have offered a slight combat advantage in societies with physical conflict, since a left-handed fighter is less familiar and harder to predict for a right-handed opponent, which could explain why the trait never disappeared despite modern everyday inconveniences. This idea remains speculative and difficult to test directly against the historical record. The ratio holds steady, decade after decade, without anyone fully explaining why it holds exactly where it does. Run a finger along your jawline, and you will find a small forward projecting point of bone, the chin. It seems unremarkable, but no other primate has one, living or extinct, including every one of our closest fossil relatives. Neanderthals, close enough to interbreed with early humans, did not have true chins. Something happened uniquely in the lineage that led to modern humans, and anatomists still do not agree on what that something was for. One early theory proposed that the chin developed simply as a structural byproduct of the human jaw shrinking as diets softened with cooking and tool use, leaving a small protruding point behind almost as an accident of bone growth rather than a feature selected for its own sake. This mechanical byproduct theory remains plausible but has been challenged by researchers who point out that if the chin were purely incidental, it should show much more variation across human populations than it actually does, since accidental byproducts tend to vary more freely than features under active selection. A competing theory treats the chin as a product of sexual selection, the same evolutionary pressure thought to shape features used in mate choice and social signaling, proposing that a pronounced chin may have become associated with maturity, health, or social status in early humans, making it a preferred trait over generations even without any direct mechanical function. Testing this kind of theory is difficult, since it requires inferring social preferences from populations that left no written record of what they found attractive. A small piece of bone present in every human face on Earth, and still without an agreed-upon reason for being there. A third set of molars, arriving in the late teens or 20s, long after every other adult tooth has settled into place. For a large share of people, there simply is not enough room in the jaw for these teeth to emerge properly, and they become impacted, requiring surgical removal, an outcome so common that wisdom tooth extraction is one of the most frequently performed minor surgeries in many countries. The leading explanation for this mismatch centers on diet. Human jaws have grown noticeably smaller over the past several thousand years, a shift researchers have linked to the rise of cooking, food processing, and softer diets, all of which reduce the mechanical stress on a growing jaw during childhood. Less chewing stress during development appears to produce a shorter, less robust jawbone, while tooth size has not shrunk at nearly the same rate, leaving a jaw that is, in effect, too small for the full set of teeth it is genetically programmed to grow. This diet-driven jaw shrinkage theory has real support from studies comparing skeletal remains across different time periods and comparing populations with different traditional diets, but it does not fully explain why wisdom tooth impaction rates vary as much as they do, even within similar modern populations eating similar diets, or why some individuals with objectively small jaws never have any wisdom tooth problems at all. Researchers studying the trait suspect a combination of genetic jaw size variation and developmental factors, but no model yet accounts cleanly for all the variation observed. The teeth keep arriving on schedule regardless, as though the body has not yet noticed how much smaller the jaw around them has become. For much of modern medical history, the appendix was treated as a harmless leftover, a small evolutionary remnant with no real function, safely removable without consequence. Surgeons have removed it from patients for over a century with no widely documented long-term health decline, which seemed to settle the question. More recent research has complicated that settled view considerably. Studies published in the past 2 decades have proposed that the appendix may function as a kind of safe house for beneficial gut bacteria, a small pouch tucked away from the main flow of digestive material where certain microbes can survive and later help repopulate the gut after an illness like severe diarrhea wipes out the normal bacterial population. Comparative studies across many animal species have found appendix-like structures appearing independently multiple times across the evolutionary tree in species not closely related to each other, which researchers argue is a sign the structure keeps evolving because it does something useful, rather than persisting purely as random leftover tissue. Against this, other researchers point to the long track record of successful appendix removal with no measurable downside in most patients, arguing that if the appendix served an essential microbial reservoir function, its absence should produce some detectable difference in gut health or immune function, and large studies looking for that difference have found only modest, inconsistent effects at best. The honest current state of the science sits between these two positions. The appendix appears to do something related to gut bacteria and possibly immune function, but not something essential enough that its removal reliably causes harm. A small pouch, present in nearly everyone, still waiting for medicine to fully agree on what it is actually for. In most animal species, females remain fertile for close to the full length of their natural lifespan. Humans are a striking exception, along with a small handful of species, including certain whales, where females routinely live decades past the point their bodies stop being able to reproduce. From a strict evolutionary standpoint, this is unusual enough to demand an explanation, since natural selection generally favors traits that extend reproduction, not traits that end it early while leaving decades of life remaining. The most widely supported explanation is known as the grandmother hypothesis. It proposes that once early human children became slow to mature and heavily dependent on caregiving for many years, a woman's genes could sometimes be passed on more effectively by stopping her own reproduction and instead helping to raise grandchildren, sharing food, protection, and knowledge, than by continuing to bear children herself later in life when the risks of childbirth rise and the odds of surviving to raise a new infant to independence fall. Studies of some traditional human societies and of resident killer whale pods, another species with post-reproductive females, have found real evidence that the presence of grandmothers measurably improves the survival odds of grandchildren, lending support to the hypothesis. What the grandmother hypothesis has not fully settled is why menopause occurs at a fairly specific age rather than as a gradual decline, or why it evolved in humans and a small number of whale species, but not in most other long-lived, socially complex animals like elephants, which show no equivalent reproductive cutoff despite also living in multi-generational family groups. Why the body stops so cleanly, while so much of life still clearly remains, is a question evolution has not finished answering. Step onto ice and the loss of friction is immediate and dramatic, far more dramatic than the smoothness of the surface alone would suggest. For over a century, the standard explanation was pressure melting. The idea that the weight of a skate blade or a boot sole pressed down hard enough to briefly melt a thin layer of ice into water, which then acted as a lubricant. This explanation has a serious problem. The math does not work. The pressure exerted by an ordinary boot or skate is nowhere near enough to melt ice at the temperatures where skating and sliding still happen easily, sometimes well below freezing. The explanation that has gradually replaced pressure melting focuses on the surface of the ice itself, rather than any pressure applied to it. Ice, even at temperatures far below freezing, maintains an extremely thin layer of disordered, liquid-like molecules on its outermost surface, because the water molecules there are not held in place by neighbors on all sides the way molecules deeper in the ice are. This quasi-liquid layer, only a few molecules thick, appears to exist on ice, regardless of whether anything is touching it, and friction from movement across the surface may thin or slightly warm this layer further, adding to the slipperiness. The precise physics of this thin surface layer, exactly how it forms, how its thickness changes with temperature, and how much it alone accounts for ice's famous slipperiness compared to other contributing factors like friction-generated heat, remains an active area of research in surface physics, with details still being refined through increasingly precise laboratory measurements, decades after the pressure melting theory was first shown to be inadequate. A solid block of frozen water, and still, right at its very surface, something that behaves like neither ice nor water cleanly. In 1963, a Tanzanian secondary school student named Erasto Mpemba noticed something that seemed to contradict common sense while making ice cream in a school cooking class. A mixture that started out hot froze before an identical mixture that started out cold. He asked his teacher about it and was reportedly told the result was impossible, that hot liquid simply could not freeze faster than cold liquid. Mpemba kept testing it anyway, and years later, working with a physics professor, published his observation formally. It has been called the Mpemba effect ever since. The effect has since been observed, under certain specific conditions, in numerous experiments, though not consistently or universally, which is part of what has made it so difficult to pin down scientifically. Several explanations have been proposed. Hot water evaporates faster, leaving less liquid that needs to freeze. Hot water can also lose more dissolved gas, which changes how ice crystals form. Convection currents in a cooling container of hot water may distribute temperature differently than in a container of cold water that never developed the same currents. Each of these effects is real and measurable in isolation, but none of them alone fully accounts for every reported instance of the phenomenon, and different experiments testing the effect have sometimes produced contradictory results depending on the exact container, water purity, and cooling method used. Some physicists have gone as far as questioning whether the Mpemba effect is a single unified phenomenon at all, or a name loosely applied to several different overlapping effects that happen to produce a similar surprising outcome under different specific circumstances. The debate over that basic question remains unresolved in the physics literature, A simple classroom observation, over 60 years old, and physics still has not fully closed the case. A popular claim has circulated for years that old window panes are thicker at the bottom because glass is secretly a slow-flowing liquid, gradually sagging downward over centuries. This is false and easily disproven. The uneven thickness comes from old glass-making methods that never produced perfectly uniform panes, and installers of the time tended to place the thicker edge at the bottom for stability. But underneath this popular myth sits a genuinely unresolved scientific question, because glass really does resist easy classification as either a liquid or a solid. Glass is what materials scientists call an amorphous solid. Unlike a crystal, where atoms arrange themselves into a repeating, orderly lattice as the material cools and hardens, glass cools so quickly during manufacturing that its atoms get frozen in a disordered arrangement, similar in structure to a liquid, but rigid and solid in every practical sense a person would ever encounter. This puts glass in a genuinely strange category, structurally liquid-like, but mechanically behaving as a hard, stable solid at room temperature for any timescale relevant to human experience. What remains an active and unresolved research question is the deeper physics of exactly how and why this disordered atomic arrangement becomes locked into place, a process called the glass transition, and why it happens at a specific temperature for a given material rather than gradually. Physicists have proposed multiple competing models to describe what happens to the atoms as a liquid cools into a glass, and predicting the precise glass transition behavior of new materials from first principles remains difficult enough that it is considered one of the significant open problems in condensed matter physics. Somewhere between a liquid and a solid, glass has settled into a category still waiting for physics to fully describe. Watch water pour smoothly from a tap at low pressure, then turn the tap further and watch the flow suddenly break into chaotic swirling. That transition, from smooth flow to turbulence, is one of the most common physical events in daily life, present in rivers, weather systems, and the air moving over an airplane wing. It is also, mathematically, one of the great unsolved problems in physics. The equations that describe how fluids move, called the Navier-Stokes equations, were written down in the 19th century and have been used successfully ever since to model everything from ocean currents to blood flow, usually with the help of approximations and powerful computers. What has never been proven is a more fundamental mathematical question: whether these equations always have a smooth, well-behaved solution in 3 dimensions, for any starting condition, or whether, under some circumstances, they could produce a mathematical breakdown, a point where the equations themselves stop making physical sense. This question is considered so significant and so difficult that it is one of 7 Millennium Prize problems in mathematics, with a substantial cash prize offered to anyone who can resolve it either way. The practical consequence of this unsolved gap is that engineers and physicists cannot fully predict turbulent flow from first principles. Instead, they rely heavily on approximation, simulation, and empirical data gathered from experiments, an approach that works remarkably well in practice but sidesteps rather than answers the deeper mathematical question of why turbulence behaves the way it does at its most chaotic extremes. A phenomenon visible every time water swirls down a drain, and still, its mathematical foundation formally unsolved. Certain songbirds travel thousands of kilometers each year between breeding and wintering grounds, often returning to the same small patch of forest or field with remarkable precision, guided in part by a sense that has no clear equivalent in human experience: the ability to detect Earth's magnetic field. This ability, called magnetoreception, has been demonstrated repeatedly in careful behavioral experiments, but the physical mechanism behind it is still not fully agreed upon. The leading hypothesis involves a light-sensitive protein called cryptochrome, found in the retina of birds' eyes, and a quantum-level chemical process called the radical pair mechanism. The idea is that when light hits cryptochrome, it can briefly create a pair of molecules with linked, or entangled, electron spins, and Earth's magnetic field can subtly influence how those spins behave relative to each other, altering the chemical outcome of the reaction in a way that depends on the bird's orientation relative to the field. In theory, this could let a bird perceive the magnetic field as a kind of visual overlay on what it already sees, though this has never been directly confirmed inside a living bird's brain. Support for this theory includes experiments showing that certain migratory birds lose their magnetic sense when exposed to specific radio frequency interference that would be expected to disrupt a quantum radical pair process, but should not affect a simple mechanical or metallic sensor. This is considered suggestive evidence rather than proof, since researchers have not yet directly observed the proposed quantum mechanism happening inside bird retinal cells during an actual magnetic sensing event. A bird finds its way across an entire continent using a sense that may run on quantum physics, and no laboratory has yet watched it happen directly. The platypus is already an unusual animal, an egg-laying mammal with a duck-like bill and a venomous spur on its hind leg. Less widely known is that its bill contains thousands of specialized receptors capable of detecting the faint electric fields naturally produced by the muscle contractions of nearby prey moving underwater, a sense called electroreception, more commonly associated with sharks and certain fish than with any mammal. When hunting, a platypus closes its eyes, ears, and nostrils entirely, relying completely on its bill to navigate and locate food along a riverbed, guided by both touch and the electric signals given off by small invertebrates and crustaceans hiding in mud or under rocks. Researchers have confirmed this ability through controlled experiments using weak artificial electric fields, and they have mapped in detail how the receptors in the bill are structured and where their signals are processed in the platypus brain. What is far less understood is how the platypus brain actually combines electrical and mechanical touch information into a single useful sense of its surroundings while hunting, since the bill's receptors register both types of signal essentially at once, and the platypus somehow uses the resulting combined information to locate prey with considerable precision in murky or completely dark water, where vision would be useless anyway. Some researchers suspect the two signal types may be processed by overlapping neural circuitry in a way that effectively creates a unified sixth sense, distinct from either touch or electroreception alone, but the details of how this integration happens at the level of individual neurons remain an active area of study. An animal already strange enough to have baffled the naturalists who first described it, still hunting by a sense science has not fully mapped. An octopus has roughly 500 million neurons in its nervous system, a number in the same range as many mammals, but distributed in an unusual way. Only about a third sit in the central brain, while the remaining two-thirds are spread throughout its 8 arms, giving each arm a substantial degree of independent processing power of its own. Experiments have shown that a severed octopus arm can still respond to touch, and even reach toward food for a short time after separation from the body. Evidence that meaningful sensory processing and basic motor control are genuinely happening at the level of the arm itself, not simply relayed instructions arriving from the central brain. Researchers studying octopus behavior have proposed that this distributed nervous system may allow each arm to explore grip and react to its immediate surroundings somewhat autonomously, freeing the central brain from having to micromanage every individual arm movement in real time, which would be an efficient solution for an animal that needs to simultaneously explore crevices, manipulate objects, and watch for predators. What remains genuinely unresolved is how unified the octopus' overall experience actually is, whether there is a single, coherent center of awareness coordinating information from all 8 semi-independent arms, or whether an octopus mind is closer to a loose federation of partly autonomous processing centers that only occasionally need to consult a central authority. Some researchers describe the octopus as possessing something closer to 9 partial brains working in coordination rather than one brain directing 8 limbs. Though this remains a working description rather than a settled neuroscientific conclusion, since testing what an octopus subjectively experiences is an extraordinarily difficult problem, even in principle. Somewhere in that spread-out nervous system, an octopus is thinking, in a shape of mind no human has direct access to. Step outside just before sunrise in almost any wooded area and you will likely hear it, a sudden, dense wave of birdsong, far louder and more layered than at any other point in the day. This is the dawn chorus, and it has been observed by naturalists for centuries, yet the specific reason birds concentrate so much of their singing to this narrow window remains genuinely debated among ornithologists. One long-standing explanation focuses on acoustics. Cool, still, low-wind conditions common at dawn allow sound to travel farther and more clearly than during the warmer, more turbulent air of midday, meaning a bird singing at dawn can broadcast its territorial or mating signal to a much larger audience for the same amount of energy spent. A second theory focuses on timing and energy. Light levels at dawn are too low for efficient foraging, but bright enough for singing, meaning birds may simply be filling an otherwise unproductive window with the one activity that does not require good light to be effective. A third theory treats the dawn chorus as a signal specifically of individual quality and survival, since a male bird that can afford to spend significant energy singing loudly first thing in the morning, before having eaten anything since the previous evening, is demonstrating to potential mates and rivals that it survived the night in strong enough condition to sing vigorously on an empty stomach, a costly and therefore honest signal of fitness. None of these three explanations has been shown to fully account for the pattern on its own, and most current researchers suspect the dawn chorus results from some combination of all three pressures acting together, though disentangling exactly how much each one contributes remains difficult given how many species and conditions are involved. Every morning the chorus arrives again, right on schedule, for reasons still only partly agreed upon. Drop an object and it falls. Of all the forces in physics, gravity is the one every person experiences constantly and intuitively from the moment they first learn to stand. It is also the one fundamental force that physics has never successfully merged into a single unified framework with the others. Modern physics rests on two extraordinarily successful but incompatible theories. General relativity, developed by Albert Einstein, describes gravity not as a force in the traditional sense, but as the curvature of space and time itself caused by mass and energy, and it has been confirmed to extraordinary precision at large scales, from the bending of starlight around the sun to the detection of gravitational waves from colliding black holes. Quantum mechanics, meanwhile, describes the other three fundamental forces, electromagnetism and the two nuclear forces, with equally extraordinary precision at the scale of individual particles. The problem is that these two frameworks, both individually verified again and again, do not fit together mathematically. Attempts to describe gravity using the same quantum framework that works for the other forces consistently produce nonsensical results. Physicists have proposed several candidate approaches to resolve this, including string theory and loop quantum gravity, each attempting to describe gravity in a way compatible with quantum mechanics at the smallest scales, particularly relevant inside black holes and at the very beginning of the universe, where both frameworks are needed simultaneously and neither alone is sufficient. None of these candidate theories has been experimentally confirmed, largely because testing them would require energy levels or precision far beyond what current technology can achieve. The force holding every person to the ground is also the one force physics has never managed to fully explain. According to the standard model of particle physics, the extremely hot, dense early universe should have produced matter and antimatter in exactly equal amounts, since nearly every known particle-producing process creates matching pairs, one particle and its antimatter counterpart at the same time. Matter and antimatter annihilate completely on contact, converting entirely into energy. If the early universe truly produced equal amounts of both, it should have annihilated itself down to nothing but light almost immediately, leaving no stars, no planets, and no matter of any kind left over to eventually form anything at all. Clearly that did not happen. The universe is full of matter, and observable antimatter is exceedingly rare, found only in small amounts produced briefly in extreme events like cosmic rays or particle accelerators. This mismatch between prediction and observation is called the baryon asymmetry problem, and it is considered one of the central unsolved questions in physics. Some very small asymmetry must have existed in the early universe, a tiny excess of matter over antimatter, roughly one extra particle of matter for every billion matching pairs that annihilated, and that tiny surviving excess is everything that exists today, every star, every planet, every person. Physicists have found real, if small, evidence that certain particles do behave slightly asymmetrically between matter and antimatter versions of themselves, a property called charge parity violation, first observed in the 1960s. The trouble is that the measured asymmetry from known particle interactions is far too small by many orders of magnitude to account for the actual amount of matter that exists in the universe today. Something else, some as yet undiscovered particle or process, is presumed to be responsible for the rest of the imbalance, but it has not been found. Everything solid that has ever existed is the leftover from an imbalance physics still cannot fully account for. Every star, planet and person is made of ordinary matter, the atoms studied in chemistry class. According to the best current measurements of the universe, ordinary matter accounts for only about 5% of its total mass and energy. The rest is something else entirely, and a significant share of that remainder, roughly a quarter of the universe's total content, is something astronomers call dark matter, detected only through its gravitational effects and never observed directly. The case for dark matter's existence comes from several independent lines of evidence. Galaxies rotate faster at their outer edges than the visible matter within them should allow, given the gravity that visible stars and gas alone could produce, suggesting a large amount of additional unseen mass is present. Clusters of galaxies bend light passing near them, a phenomenon called gravitational lensing, by amounts too strong to be explained by their visible matter alone. And detailed measurements of the faint background radiation left over from the early universe match predictions, only if a substantial amount of unseen mass is included in the model. These independent lines of evidence, from entirely different areas of astrophysics, all point toward the same conclusion. What dark matter actually is remains unknown. It does not emit, absorb, or reflect light, and it has never been directly detected in any laboratory experiment, despite decades of increasingly sensitive attempts, using deep underground detectors designed to catch a rare direct collision between a dark matter particle and ordinary matter. Numerous candidate particles have been proposed, and numerous experiments have searched for them, and so far every direct search has come back empty. A quarter of everything that exists is presumed real by its gravity alone, and has still never once been caught. In 1928, physicist Paul Dirac was working through the mathematics of combining quantum mechanics with special relativity when his equations produced an unexpected result. Alongside the electron, a particle already well known at the time, the math predicted the existence of a second particle, identical in mass but with the opposite electric charge. Dirac had not set out looking for a new particle. It fell directly out of the equation, a purely mathematical prediction that at first seemed almost too strange to take literally. 4 years later, physicist Carl Anderson detected exactly this particle in cosmic ray experiments and named it the positron, the antimatter counterpart of the electron. It was one of the first and cleanest examples in the history of physics of a mathematical equation predicting a real, physical particle before anyone had observed it, a pattern that would later repeat with other particles. Since then, physicists have confirmed that every known type of particle has a corresponding antimatter counterpart, and antimatter can now be produced and briefly studied in particle accelerators. What remains unresolved is why the observable universe today contains so little antimatter compared to ordinary matter, given that the underlying laws of physics treat matter and antimatter almost, but not quite, symmetrically. This connects directly to the broader baryon asymmetry problem. The small measured differences between how matter and antimatter particles behave are real, but nowhere near large enough to explain why the universe ended up so overwhelmingly one-sided. Antimatter exists, is fully understood in principle, and can be created in a lab, and physics still cannot fully explain why nature so strongly favored its opposite. A particle first found in an equation before it was ever found in nature, and nature still has not explained why it kept so little of it around. Play a video of a cup shattering on the floor and then play it in reverse, and anyone watching will instantly recognize which direction is correct. Play a video of 2 billiard balls colliding and reverse it, and the reversed version looks just as physically plausible as the original. This asymmetry sits at the heart of one of physics' oldest puzzles. The basic equations governing individual particle interactions work identically whether time runs forward or backward, and yet, at the scale of everyday experience, time clearly only ever moves in one direction. The standard explanation involves a concept called entropy, roughly described as a measure of disorder, or the number of ways a system's parts could be arranged, while still looking the same overall. Physicists have shown that entropy in an isolated system tends to increase over time, simply because disordered arrangements vastly outnumber ordered ones, so a system left alone will almost always drift toward more disorder rather than less, purely as a matter of probability rather than any special force pushing it in that direction. This explains why a shattered cup does not spontaneously reassemble. An intact cup represents one of an enormous number of possible disordered arrangements the pieces could theoretically fall into, and reassembly would require an astronomically unlikely coincidence. What entropy explains less completely is why the universe started out in an extremely low entropy, highly ordered state in the first place, since if entropy simply increases over time, something must account for why it began so low rather than already near its maximum. This is sometimes called the past hypothesis, and while most physicists accept some version of it as necessary, explaining why the early universe specifically began in that unlikely ordered state remains a genuinely open question in cosmology. Time keeps moving forward, one shattered cup at a time, for reasons that trace back to a beginning still not fully explained. If the universe were infinite, unchanging, and evenly filled with stars, as many early astronomers assumed it was, then looking in any direction at night should eventually put a star directly in your line of sight, no matter how far away, meaning the entire sky should glow as brightly as the surface of a star, rather than appearing mostly dark between the points of light we actually see. This puzzle became known as Olbers' paradox, named after the German astronomer who popularized it in the 19th century, though earlier thinkers had noted the same problem. The modern resolution rests on two facts about the actual universe that 19th century astronomers did not yet know. First, the universe is not infinitely old. It had a beginning roughly 13.8 billion years ago, which means light from extremely distant stars simply has not had time to reach Earth yet, no matter how far the universe extends. Second, the universe is expanding, and light from very distant, rapidly receding sources gets stretched to longer wavelengths, a phenomenon called redshift, which shifts much of that ancient light out of the visible range entirely and into wavelengths the human eye cannot detect. Together, a finite observable universe and cosmic redshift explain why the night sky is mostly dark rather than uniformly bright, resolving the original paradox convincingly. What remains open, connected to this same territory, are deeper questions about what lies beyond the observable universe, the region light has not yet had time to reach us from, and whether the universe extends infinitely beyond that boundary or not. Because no signal from beyond the observable universe can ever reach Earth even in principle, this may be a question cosmology is permanently unable to answer through direct observation alone. The dark spaces between stars turn out to be evidence of a beginning, one whose full edges may never be seen. A small set of numbers appear throughout the equations of physics. The strength of gravity, the strength of the force holding atomic nuclei together, the mass of the electron, and several others. These numbers are not predicted by any deeper theory. They are simply measured and then plugged into the equations as fixed values. What has struck many physicists as strange is how narrow the acceptable range for several of these constants appears to be for a universe capable of producing atoms, stable stars, and eventually life at all. Adjust the strength of the nuclear force by a relatively small amount in either direction, and calculations suggest stars would either be unable to form heavier elements at all, or would burn through their fuel so quickly that stable planetary systems would never have time to develop. Adjust the strength of gravity relative to electromagnetism and the balance that allows stars to form and burn steadily over billions of years, rather than either collapsing immediately or never igniting, could be disrupted. This apparent narrowness across several unrelated constants at once is called the fine-tuning problem, and it has prompted a range of proposed explanations. One proposed explanation invokes a multiverse, the idea that many separate universes exist with different physical constants in each, and that observers, by simple necessity, only ever find themselves in the rare universe where the constants happen to allow for stars, chemistry, and life. This remains entirely untestable with current or foreseeable technology, since other universes, if they exist, cannot be directly observed. Other physicists argue the apparent fine-tuning is overstated, or that some deeper undiscovered theory will eventually explain why the constants take the values they do, without needing multiple universes at all. No consensus has formed around any single explanation. The numbers sit exactly where they need to for stars and atoms and people to exist, and physics still cannot fully say why. In 1960, physicist Eugene Wigner published an essay with a memorable title, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. His observation was simple but strange when examined closely. Mathematicians frequently develop entire branches of mathematics purely as abstract intellectual exercises, with no application in mind whatsoever, and yet, sometimes decades later, physicists discover that exact same abstract mathematics is precisely what is needed to describe some newly discovered feature of the physical world. The most famous example involves non-Euclidean geometry, a purely theoretical mathematical framework developed in the 19th century to explore what geometry would look like on curved surfaces, with no expectation of physical application. Decades later, Albert Einstein needed exactly this mathematics, essentially unchanged, to formulate general relativity's description of curved space and time. Imaginary numbers, once considered a mathematical curiosity with no real-world counterpart, turned out to be essential to the equations of quantum mechanics. In case after case across the history of physics, mathematics invented for its own sake, with no eye toward describing nature, has later turned out to be exactly what nature required. Winner's essay did not offer a resolution to this puzzle so much as name it clearly. Why should abstract patterns, invented entirely within the human mind with no reference to the physical world, so reliably turn out to match the deep structure of reality itself? Philosophers and physicists have proposed various answers since, from the idea that mathematics is discovered rather than invented, existing independently of human minds, to more deflationary views that argue mathematicians simply tend to focus on the small subset of mathematical structures that turn out to be useful, while ignoring the vast majority that never find any application. Neither camp has settled the question definitively. An idea invented on paper, for no reason but its own internal beauty, keeps turning out to describe the world anyway. In 1912, a rare book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich acquired an unusual illustrated manuscript, filled with flowing, confident handwriting in a script no one recognized, alongside detailed drawings of unidentifiable plants, astronomical diagrams, and small nude figures bathing in strange interconnected pools. Radiocarbon dating later placed the manuscript's parchment to the early 15th century, ruling out the possibility that it was a much later hoax created from modern materials. And yet, more than a century after Voynich brought it to public attention, no one has ever successfully translated a single page. The manuscript script, now called Voynichese, follows clear statistical patterns consistent with a real language or cipher, including word-length distributions and repeated patterns similar to what appears in genuine written texts, which argues against it being pure meaningless gibberish. Codebreakers who successfully cracked far more sophisticated wartime ciphers during the 20th century have tried and failed to decode it. Some researchers have proposed it is an unknown natural language written in an invented alphabet. Others suggest it is an elaborate constructed language or cipher system unique to its unknown author, and a smaller number have argued it could be an elaborate hoax specifically designed to look statistically language-like, without carrying any real meaning at all, though this theory struggles to explain why a medieval author would invest the enormous time required to produce over 200 pages of consistent fake script and detailed illustration for no discernible purpose. Modern computational linguistics and even artificial intelligence tools have been applied to the manuscript in recent years, and while researchers occasionally announce partial breakthroughs, none of these claimed decodings has held up to independent scrutiny by the wider community of specialists studying the text. The manuscript sits in a library at Yale University today, fully preserved, fully photographed, and still entirely unread. Across a stretch of arid desert plateau in southern Peru, ancient people carved enormous figures into the ground by removing a top layer of reddish stones to reveal the paler soil beneath, creating lines and shapes that stretch, in some cases, for hundreds of meters. Some depict animals, a hummingbird, a monkey, a spider. Others are simply long straight lines or geometric shapes, running across the landscape in ways that only become fully legible from high above, far higher than anyone standing on the ground could ever have seen them, in centuries before human flight existed. Created by the Nazca people between roughly 2,000 and 1,500 years ago, the lines have survived largely because of the region's unusually dry, stable climate and near-total absence of rain or wind erosion. Archaeologists agree on how they were made, a relatively simple technique requiring only basic surveying tools and considerable coordinated labor, but there is no similar agreement on why they were made in the first place, since the culture that created them left no written explanation. Several serious theories have been proposed. Some archaeologists argue the lines had astronomical significance, possibly marking the positions of the sun or certain stars at significant times of year, though attempts to match specific lines to specific celestial events have produced inconsistent results across different studies. Others propose the lines served a ritual purpose connected to water, since the region depends heavily on scarce water sources, with some lines appearing to point toward underground water channels or converge near dry riverbeds. A third theory treats the lines as walking paths for ritual processions, meant to be experienced from the ground while walking their length, rather than viewed from above at all. No single theory has gathered enough evidence to be considered settled over the others. Whoever carved the ground for reasons of their own, the desert has kept the shapes intact long after the reasons themselves went silent. On a stretch of open plain in southern England stands a circle of massive standing stones, some weighing over 20 tons, arranged with a level of precision that has drawn visitors and researchers for centuries. Construction happened in phases over an extended period, roughly starting around 5,000 years ago, with the largest sarsen stones raised later and the smaller blue stones added at various points across a span of many centuries. What has fascinated researchers most is the origin of those smaller blue stones. Geological analysis has traced them to a specific set of outcrops in the Priestley Hills of Wales, a distance of well over 200 kilometres from Stonehenge itself. Moving multi-ton stones across that distance, using only Neolithic technology with no wheels or draft animals suited to the task documented in the region at that time, represents an extraordinary logistical achievement, and archaeologists still debate the exact method, whether the stones were dragged overland on wooden sledges, floated partway by river and sea on rafts, or moved by some combination of both, since no direct physical evidence of the transport method itself has survived. Even more contested than the transport method is the monument's original purpose. Proposed explanations include an astronomical calendar, since the monument aligns closely with the sunrise on the summer solstice and sunset on the winter solstice, a ceremonial burial site, supported by the discovery of cremated human remains at the site dating across many centuries of use, and a place of healing, based on ancient folklore recorded much later associating the bluestones with curative properties. Current archaeological consensus treats the monument as likely serving several of these purposes across its long multi-phase history rather than any single one, though the full picture remains genuinely incomplete. The stones have stood through 5,000 years of changing purpose, longer by far than anyone has fully explained why they were raised. In 1901, divers exploring a Roman-era shipwreck near the Greek island of Antimatter recovered a heavily corroded lump of bronze that initially attracted little attention. Only years later, once the fragments were cleaned and studied closely, did researchers realize they were looking at something extraordinary, an elaborate mechanical device containing dozens of precisely cut bronze gears, built to track astronomical cycles, including the positions of the sun and moon and the timing of eclipses. Modern analysis, using X-ray imaging to see inside the corroded fragments without damaging them, has revealed a level of mechanical sophistication that would not be matched again in the historical record for well over 1,000 years, with gear-based astronomical clocks of comparable complexity not reappearing in Europe until the 14th century. The device is now generally dated to sometime in the 2nd or 1st century before the Common Era, meaning it predates its next known technological equivalent by an enormous span of time. What researchers have not been able to determine is who specifically built it, how many similar devices may once have existed, or, most puzzling of all, why the sophisticated gear cutting and mechanical design knowledge involved appears to have simply vanished afterward, leaving no clear successor devices, no detailed surviving technical writings describing the method, and no obvious continuous tradition of similarly complex Greek or Roman mechanical engineering. Some historians propose that other examples of similarly advanced mechanisms were built and have simply not survived, since bronze was frequently melted down and reused in antiquity, meaning the Antimatter mechanism may be less an isolated anomaly and more the sole survivor of a knowledge tradition otherwise erased entirely by time. A machine built too far ahead of its era survived only by accident in a shipwreck, while the knowledge that made it possible did not survive at all. On the morning of June 30th, 1908, an enormous explosion occurred over a remote, sparsely populated region of Siberia near the Tunguska River. The blast flattened an estimated 80 million trees across roughly 2,000 square kilometers of forest, felling them outward in a pattern radiating from a central point, and the shockwave was strong enough to be recorded on seismographs and barometric instruments as far away as Western Europe. Because the area was so remote, no scientific expedition reached the site until nearly 2 decades later, in 1927, by which point eyewitness accounts had to be gathered from local residents who had witnessed the event as children or young adults. The leading scientific explanation is that the event was caused by an asteroid or comet fragment entering the atmosphere and exploding several kilometers above the ground, an airburst rather than a direct ground impact, which would explain the absence of a large confirmed impact crater despite the enormous, unmistakable ground-level devastation. Most of the core details of this airburst explanation are well supported by later research, including computer modeling that has successfully reproduced the treefall pattern using estimates of an object roughly 50 to 60 meters across exploding at a specific altitude. What has remained harder to pin down with full certainty are some of the finer details, including the object's precise composition, whether it was more likely a stony asteroid or an icy comet fragment, since the two would leave somewhat different chemical traces in the soil, and researchers examining samples from the region over the decades have reported some inconsistent findings that have kept a small amount of scientific debate alive around the exact nature of the object, even though the general airburst explanation itself is broadly accepted. A blast powerful enough to level a forest the size of a large city arrived from somewhere else entirely, and the exact object responsible was never recovered. In 2011, a Swedish diving and treasure hunting team using sonar equipment to search for shipwrecks in the Baltic Sea recorded an unusual formation on the seafloor at a depth of roughly 90 meters, a large, roughly circular object with a disc-like shape, apparently sitting atop a longer trailing structure resembling a runway or staircase. The sonar images, once released publicly, quickly attracted widespread attention and speculation, ranging from a sunken vessel to more extraordinary claims involving an unidentified or ancient structure. Geologists who have examined the available sonar data have generally concluded that the formation is most likely a natural feature, consistent with material deposited or shaped by glacial activity during the last ice age, when massive moving ice sheets across the region routinely rearranged rock, sediment, and boulders into unusual formations, some of which can appear deceptively artificial-looking in low-resolution sonar imagery, particularly when the resolution is not sharp enough to clearly distinguish natural rock texture from a manufactured surface. This glacial explanation is considered the most scientifically plausible account and is favored by the great majority of researchers who have reviewed the case. What has kept the story alive, well beyond a simple settled geological explanation, is the relatively low resolution of the original sonar scans, combined with a small number of follow-up dives that reportedly experienced unusual equipment malfunctions near the site, malfunctions that skeptics attribute to ordinary equipment failure in a difficult deep-water environment, but which have never been definitively explained one way or the other in any published, peer-reviewed account. No conclusive higher-resolution imaging or physical sample analysis has yet been made fully public to settle the matter beyond reasonable dispute, a formation almost certainly explained by an ice age that ended tens of thousands of years ago, sitting quietly at the bottom of the sea, still not entirely closed as a question. On the night of August 15, 1977, an astronomer named J.A.E. Amon was reviewing printouts from Ohio State University's Big Ear radio telescope, part of an ongoing search for signals that might indicate extraterrestrial origin, when he noticed a sequence of characters representing an unusually strong, narrow-band radio signal, far more intense than the background noise the telescope normally recorded. Struck by how unusual the reading was, he circled the sequence in red pen and wrote a single word in the margin: "Wow. The signal has been known by that name ever since." The signal lasted for the full 72 seconds that the telescope's fixed observation window allowed it to be recorded, matched several characteristics that researchers had specifically been looking for as a plausible marker of an artificial, non-natural source, and appeared to originate from a specific point in the sky near the constellation Sagittarius. Despite extensive follow-up efforts, including repeated observations of the same coordinates using the same telescope, and later using other radio telescopes entirely, the signal has never been detected again, not once, in the decades since. Many explanations have been proposed. Some researchers have suggested it may have been a brief reflection of an ordinary terrestrial radio signal bouncing off a piece of space debris or a passing comet, a theory that gained some renewed attention decades later, when a specific comet was found to be near the right position at the right time, though this explanation remains disputed and has not been confirmed to the satisfaction of many researchers who studied the original data closely. Others maintain that no fully satisfying terrestrial or natural explanation has yet been offered, leaving the signal formally classified as unexplained. A single powerful signal arrived once, was recorded once, and in nearly 50 years has never repeated itself. Look back across everything covered so far, from a wrinkled fingertip to a signal from deep space that arrived once and never again, and a pattern starts to emerge that has nothing to do with the size of the mystery. A yawn spreading across a room and the asymmetry between matter and antimatter are, on the surface, about as different in scale as two questions could possibly be. And yet science approaches both the same way: gather what can be measured, propose an explanation that fits the measurements, and then test that explanation as hard as possible, fully expecting it might not survive the testing. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it runs against a common assumption that science is mainly in the business of delivering final answers. More often, what it actually delivers is a narrower, better understood version of the original question. The placebo effect used to be a simple curiosity. Now it is a genuinely complicated finding about expectation, ritual, and the body's own chemistry, still short of a complete explanation but far more precisely understood than it was a century ago. The night sky's darkness used to be an open paradox. It is now a solved puzzle that opens directly onto a deeper, currently unsolvable question about what lies beyond what can ever be observed. Almost every item in this list follows that same shape: progress that sharpens a mystery rather than erasing it. None of this is a weakness of science. It is closer to the opposite. A field honest enough to keep publishing its own unfinished business in plain view, rather than quietly settling on a comfortable answer and moving on. The gap between a wrinkled finger and a signal from beyond the solar system turns out to be smaller than it looks, once you notice that both are simply places where careful observation ran up against the edge of current understanding. Somewhere tonight, someone is noticing something ordinary closely enough to turn it into the next open question. There is no tidy way to close a list like this, and it would not suit the material to try. 50 things, some as small as a hiccup, and some as vast as the imbalance between matter and antimatter, and every single one of them still sits, at least in part, outside the reach of a full explanation. That is not a flaw in the list. It is closer to the point of making it at all. It is worth remembering that a handful of these mysteries have been narrowed considerably even in the last 20 years. Itch had no dedicated nerve pathway in the textbooks until researchers found one. The placebo effect used to be dismissed as a nuisance in clinical trials before it became a serious subject of study in its own right. Icy's slipperiness used to be explained by a theory that, once examined closely, simply did not hold up under the numbers, and something closer to the truth has slowly taken its place. None of this happened quickly, and none of it happened by anyone deciding in advance what the answer should be. It happened by people noticing something ordinary, refusing to let the familiar explanation go unchallenged, and testing it patiently until a better one earned its place. Two things have been true since the beginning of this episode, and they are still true now. Science keeps refining its account of the universe with extraordinary precision, and ordinary human experience keeps producing small, stubborn puzzles that refuse to fully resolve, no matter how much precision is brought to bear on them. Both of those things can be true at once without any contradiction. A yawn spreading across a room and a signal from deep repeated are, in their own separate ways, still waiting. Somewhere between the itch on your arm and the dark spaces between the stars, there is more left to notice than any single evening could cover. Let that sit for a while. There is no need to resolve it tonight, or ever, really. Thank you for spending this time here, inside questions that have earned the right to stay open a little longer.